Hi, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on one of the most exciting and turbulent times in all of world history, Russian history from 1881 to 1921. 1881 was a pivotal year in Russian history because it was the year that Alexander II was assassinated. Alexander II, also known as the Tsar Liberator or Tsar Osvoboditelь, was responsible for the emancipation of the serfs in 1861 and many other liberal reforms of the period. However, instead of making people happy, his commitment to liberalism and reform made a lot of people unhappy, especially liberal reformers. They wanted more reform faster. And in this period, in the late 1800s, activist and even terrorist organizations became popular. Many young people, especially college students, became activists and even joined terrorist organizations. One of the biggest, most popular, and most effective terrorist organizations was Narodnaya Volya, or People's Will. And they were the organization who successfully assassinated Alexander II on March 13th, 1881. They threw a bomb at his carriage as he was riding down the street in St. Petersburg, and he died shortly after that. Spas na Krevi, the Savior on the Blood Church, which you've no doubt seen if you've been to St. Petersburg or even seen any pictures of St. Petersburg. It's one of the most iconic images of St. Petersburg, was erected on the site of the assassination. That's why it's called Spas na Krevi, the Savior on the Blood. After Alexander II was assassinated, his son Alexander III came to power and ruled from 1881 to 1894. Unlike his father, who was a committed liberal and reformer, Alexander III was a reactionary who, perhaps not unsurprisingly, was very distrustful of liberalism, Western ideas, and reform, and not only refused to continue reforms, but actually tried to reverse the liberal reforms of his father. So instead of moving towards a constitutional monarchy, which is what many people wanted, he actually strengthened the power of the autocracy. On the personal level, he was, unlike his father or his granduncle or other members of the Romanov family, sort of a typical Russian. You can see in the picture in the PowerPoint his bluff, hearty appearance. He was known as a kind of a real Russian kind of a guy. One of the most famous things that he did was he was in a train crash, and he actually helped lift up the train car so that the rest of his family could escape. So no one can doubt his personal courage or his physical hardiness, but nonetheless, he ruled over a period of what turned out to be decline in Russia. Following the death of Alexander III in 1894, Nicholas II, his son, inherited the throne. Nicholas is famous, infamous, for presiding over the collapse of the Russian Empire, and although he did contribute to it in many ways, he can't be held wholly to blame. He inherited a very difficult and volatile situation from his father, with tension between reformers and anti-reformers growing ever stronger. There was a clear need for reform, but no one could agree on how to carry out these reforms. Russia clearly needed to change something. Its autocracy and its agrarian society was not sustainable on its current path, but no one could decide what to do. Nicholas did try to institute some small reforms, but he refused to change the autocracy, with the power wholly concentrated in the hands of the Tsar, to a constitutional monarchy, as, for example, we could see with his cousin, King George, in England. And many people in Russia felt that Russia should follow in Britain's footsteps, but Nicholas refused to do so, and many people also believed that Russia should not do so. So they were at a bit of an impasse there for several years. One of the things that pushed Russia and the reformers versus the anti-reformers out of this impasse was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Russia had already expanded all the way to the Pacific coast, but they wanted a warm water port on the Pacific. Vladivostok did not have year-round water access. It froze over in the winter. And Russia and Japan, which was becoming stronger and stronger, became embroiled in a conflict over who had the biggest sphere of influence in Manchuria and Korea. Basically, Japan wanted to carve up Manchuria and Korea with Russia, but Russia didn't want to share any of its influence or territory with Japan. To everyone's great surprise, Japan won the war, which was a huge humiliation for Russia, and shifted the balance of power in East Asia. Russia had been seen as the dominant power in Eurasia for the better part of a century, ever since the Napoleonic Wars, but now it had been overthrown by tiny little Japan. The Russo-Japanese War and Russia's poor performance in it strengthened the call for reform and revealed just how much Russia needed to change. It was one of the factors that led to the first Russian Revolution, the 1905 Revolution. Other events that led to the 1905 Revolution were Bloody Sunday. In January of 1905, people marching on the Winter Palace were shot down by troops, and up to 1,000 people were killed by imperial troops. Later, in the summer of 1905, soldiers and sailors began to mutiny, most famously the crew on the battleship Potemkin. Their mutiny was later made into a famous film by Sergei Eisenstein and has become one of the iconic moments of the 1905 revolution. All this unrest led to the October Manifesto. In the end of October, the Tsar conceded to the calls for a constitutional monarchy and signed an agreement forming the Duma, which we still have, and a move towards universal suffrage. Universal suffrage did not exist yet, but there was an agreement to move towards universal suffrage. The 1905 revolution and the reforms it brought about did bring some breathing room to the Tsar and Russia, but people were still very unhappy, and there was still a lot of pressure for change and reform. The government was still cracking down very hard on anything that it perceived as opposition or protest. Of course, they did actually have terrorist organizations working, and they also cracked down hard on non-terrorists as well. This led to lots of executions and arrests in this period, the period before World War I, which led to considerable protest by authors such as Tolstoy, who wrote a manifesto called "Я не могу молчать," I cannot be silent, although perhaps the best literary work of the period in protest of the government repressions and specifically the executions that were happening daily at the time was Leonid Andreev's Рассказ о семи повешенных, the story of 7 who were hanged. Things might have settled down, but then World War I broke out. And Russia was drawn into World War I because of its alliance with France and its desire to protect Serbia and its fellow Slavs, especially Orthodox Slavs. However, Russia was catastrophically unprepared for the war. They had had a series of defeats, starting with the Crimean War, and then, of course, the Russo-Japanese War, but this had not made them any better prepared, and they went into World War I with a critical shortage of equipment. They had lots of soldiers, but they did not have, for example, trains, they didn't have track, they didn't have equipment, they didn't even have enough bullets, so at one point soldiers were limited to 4 bullets a day. Unsurprisingly, they suffered from staggering losses. So this picture in the PowerPoint, for example, is of Russian prisoners of war who have been captured by the Germans. And all of these losses, battle defeats, all of these prisoners being taken, caused a tremendous loss of morale. And Russia was clearly losing things on the Eastern Front. The decision of Tsar Nicholas to take personal command of the war effort did not help things. So if you remember, and I'm sure if you know anything about this period, you know about Nicholas and Alexandra and Rasputin and all that. At the time, there was a lot of upheaval going on in St. Petersburg. There was the power of Rasputin, who seemed to hold this strange, fascinating power over Alexandra, Nicholas's wife, the Empress. This caused further ill will towards the royal family, and meanwhile Nicholas decided to take charge of the war effort, and he made a series of bad decisions, and things just went from bad to worse. This led to the first of the two 1917 revolutions. So the first 1917 revolution is the February Revolution, Fevral-skaya rewolucja, which took place in February in the old style. Remember that Russia used a different calendar prior to the revolution that was 13 days behind. And so it was February in Russia, but March in Europe, when women in breadlines, industrial workers, and soldiers all started demonstrating in Petrograd, or St. Petersburg as we call it now. These mass demonstrations, and you can see a picture in the PowerPoint of one of the mass demonstrations where they're demanding bread for soldiers' families. Part of the lack of equipment and lack of preparation for the war effort meant that soldiers and soldiers' families were catastrophically underfed. You can also see in the picture the number of women involved. Originally, this was kind of a women's movement. It just happened spontaneously by women gathered in the street. They started protesting and demonstrating and were joined in by soldiers and industrial workers. And this ultimately led to the abdication of Nicholas II at the end of February, or early March, as we might call it, and the formation of a parliamentary provisional government. So the idea was that Nicholas stepped down. Nicholas's son was much too young to take over. His cousin refused to take over, and so they ended up forming a parliamentary-style provisional government. But the idea was that they would then have proper elections later in the year and have a permanent parliamentary-style government. The abdication of Nicholas and the formation of the provisional government did not bring about more peace and stability, however. Instead, different factions started fighting amongst each other. The provisional government couldn't hold control of the situation, and there was unrest throughout 1917. This culminated in the October Revolution, which took place in October according to the old-style calendar, or November according to the new-style calendar, so our calendar. In late October or early November, depending on how you want to calculate it, the Bolshevik wing of the Communist Party stormed the Winter Palace and held a coup, and they took power from the provisional government and established a government of Soviets instead. And if you remember, Soviet or Soviet means council, and these were supposed to be workers' councils. That they wanted power to go to the workers and soldiers and sailors' councils instead of to the parliamentary democracy, which was largely under the control of the upper classes, of course. And the Bolsheviks were successful. Side note, Bolshevik means majority. But they were actually the minority wing of the Communist Party. They just declared themselves to be the majority, even though they weren't, and held a coup. Once they took power, they negotiated a treaty with Germany, pulling Russia out of World War I. As soon as the Bolsheviks took power, Russia broke out into civil war, and it broke out all over Russia. There was, of course, conflict in Petrograd, where the Bolshevik uprising started. And it soon spread all over the country, especially on the borders. Ukraine was a big seat of conflict. There was war in Siberia. There was war in the Caucasus, just everywhere. And the war was basically between the Reds, who were the communists, basically the Bolsheviks, although at the time there was kind of a loose alliance of Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, other people who were allied with the communists, and they were all called the Reds, and the Whites, who were pro-Tsarist or pro-provisional government. They were basically anti-Red, anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik. So the war was mainly between the Reds and the Whites. However, there were various other factions who were also fighting in the war, such as Ukrainian nationalists, who were fighting kind of against both the Reds and the Whites. They wanted Ukraine to become a separate nation. And there were Greens, who were kind of part of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, and just all kinds of chaos. And it ran from the end of 1917, although it didn't really break out until 1918. Mostly it was over by 1921, but it kind of petered out in Siberia by 1922. And although things looked bad for the Reds, it was hard to believe that they would be able to take control. The fact that they controlled Petrograd and very quickly Moscow meant that they controlled the center of the country, they controlled the seat of government, they controlled the richest, largest, strongest cities, and they were able to push back the borders and successfully defeat the whites. As you can imagine, this was a very difficult time in Russian history, a very turbulent time. A lot of people were not able to write, but a lot of people did write, and some of our most interesting writing has come out from this period. There was actually a lot of experimentation going on, just as there was political and social turmoil and unrest. There was literary and artistic experimentation, turmoil, and unrest. And so we see a lot of really interesting writing coming out of this time. It's both a reflection of the time and something that's really interesting in its own right.